Welcome to February, named after the Roman festival of purification, making it a perfect metaphor for AppSec. After all, it's the shortest month and occasionally off by one. Which means, this week, we talk with John Delaroderie from Qualys about why we keep seeing the vulns we keep seeing, and whether the shadows cast on AppSec can be avoided, or maybe their oncoming cloud security. In the news segment, Sudo goes Susudio, no, that's no good. Don't lose my number with iMessage blast doors. Both sides of the story with Lambda security docs, maybe another Phil Collins reference, and more. Prepare for that drum break and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Cloud-native development presents new challenges for security teams. Ephemeral workloads are scattered across services, and it's hard to identify resources, monitor configurations, and ensure compliance. Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks is a comprehensive cloud-native security platform, delivering full-stack protection for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. It provides deep visibility, threat detection, and data security, as well as protection for hosts, containers, and serverless while enforcing policy guardrails. Visit securityweekly.com/Prisma Cloud to gain control over your cloud security. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial.
This is episode 138, recorded February 1st, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Look out, I'm back in the house.
Back in the house. We've also got Mr. John Kinsella in the house as well. Hello, John.
Hey guys, happy Monday. Glad to be in the house.
Happy Monday. Glad to have you here. We also wonder if any of you listening have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly, even the short ones like February, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. This Thursday, February 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern, in our first technical training of 2021, you'll learn how to manage insider risks in the work from anywhere world. Register at securityweekly.com/webcasts. And if you missed any of our 2020 webcasts or technical trainings, they're available at securityweekly.com/on-demand. John Delaroderie is a security solution architect and subject matter expert for web application scanning. He has been with Qualys since early 2018, and prior to that, he worked for a variety of government agencies and private organizations in the fields of cybersecurity, incident response, digital forensics, and systems integrations. Hello, John. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So tomorrow's Groundhog Day, and you brought us this wonderful premise that AppSec seems to repeat itself without necessarily anything to show for it. Now, I know I have a few things I would name, but what is it that stood out for you that you see again and again and wish could be better that brought this idea around to you?
Yeah, sure. Well, with tomorrow being Groundhog Day, it's kind of hard not to escape the 1993 movie starring Bill Murray, which really, in my mind, elevated Groundhog Day from kind of a small regional holiday in Pennsylvania to something much larger, even though the movie has really little to do with the groundhog itself, but more a story about a man who's kind of stuck in these cycles. And it made me think about web application security, because it seems like every time we think we've seen the end of a specific vulnerability, it will rear its head again and kind of catch us off guard, where if we're not constantly cognizant and aware and ready for it, we're going to get hit with these vulnerabilities. I think this really kind of started from a 2020 article that I read where the FBI and CISA released their top 10 most exploited CVEs from 2016 through 2019. And in this top 10 list, while most of them were vulnerabilities that you would see embedded in a file that you would open up from some kind of phishing attack, there were 3 that were applicable to web applications that really kind of made me pause and really consider that the ramifications of these CVEs and how we keep seeing them. The first one on their list, coming at number 10, was the Drupal 2 vulnerability, where at the time when this was released, all Drupal websites were vulnerable to it. And that was approximately 1 million at the time. And it would allow an actor to completely take over a site until it was patched. And some of the articles I read indicate that even today, some sites are still out there running this vulnerable version of Drupal, despite it being several years later. The other ones that were on there, one was a SharePoint vulnerability where they exploited an XML sanitizer in SharePoint that is typically secure because it requires a specific type of for the XML data that users can't, arbitrarily set. It's not a variable, but researchers did find a specific form that's part of an upload that does allow a user to specify that type of, and then they were able to create these exploits. So people running a SharePoint site were vulnerable to a file upload that could then take over the site, run malicious code. The final one was, the Apache Struts vulnerability from 2017. Everybody remembers this one, the Jakarta file upload parser that, left, lots of sites vulnerable to it. And the fact that these were reported as the most often, these were part of a top 10 of the most commonly exploited CVEs for a 4-year period, really draws attention to how much these vulnerabilities weren't getting fixed and were getting exploited. And we're familiar with some of these Apache Struts vulnerabilities specifically. So I started thinking, well, okay, these were all kind of injection attacks, where people have kind of created a way to inject code into these applications that are running to run exploits. But I started to take a broader look back at some of the more common vulnerabilities that seem to catch web applications again and again. And when you hear about web applications kind of getting hacked or websites getting hacked, it's hard to avoid the specter of spear phishing or phishing attacks. And yes, I guess it's true. They're getting credentials and they're hacking these sites and pulling out information from servers and all that. So it does fall into that realm. But, we have like the Sony hacks from 2014. John Podesta's emails from the 2016 elections. So these things still continually happen to us. We have injection attacks where some of the estimates I read indicate that approximately 2/3 of all web application attacks are SQL based in nature. And if you go all the way back to like the Heartland payment system hack and like the 08-09 timeframe to even some of the more common SQL injection attacks today that we're still seeing with, especially like with some of the plugins with WordPress, it's scary that even today, after 12 plus years of it being in the press, we're still finding sites that are vulnerable to SQL. And rounding up this kind of list, to me, the more surprising one was cross-site scripting. It's a very easy one to typically detect, reflected, persisted in your DOM, things like that. But we're still seeing even today cross-site scripting attacks that can have huge ramifications. Facebook just awarded a $25,000 bug bounty for a series of DOM cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that could be chained together that could allow a malicious actor to take control of somebody's account. So even in Facebook, these cross-site scripting vulnerabilities exist. And more concerning to me was in December, just 2 months ago now, F5 had a CVE come out for their undefined endpoints in their iControl REST that attackers could take advantage of a cross-site scripting vulnerability to completely compromise the F5 control system if that user was running at an admin user context. So it made me think Groundhog Day, right? We keep seeing the same kinds of attacks happen again and again and again. And just like Bill Murray's character, we don't seem to be learning anything from these repeated exposures to these same class of vulnerabilities, whether these injection attacks we're seeing in CVEs, these cross-site scripting attacks, or these SQL vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the way you summarize this is just look at the OWASP top 10. It really hasn't changed much. The positions have changed, but a lot of the same stuff is still in the top 10 years and years and years later. To your point, John, we haven't fixed them. We've just moved them up or down the list.
But we do have one great example of success right there, a success story with the OWASP top 10, and that's CSRF, right? It came in at in like the 2007 timeframe. It was number 5. In 2013, it became number 8. 2017, it was off the list. So we do have one success story there. I don't know that we've seen the end of CSRF. I think, like many attacks, it's going to change and evolve how this threat can work over time. So we may see it come back. But to your point, yes, by and large, OWASP top 10 does not change. We've got one great success story. Why don't we see more?
Yeah, and I think you hit on a couple interesting dimensions there as you're describing this long litany of just day after day. Every day is the same. For example, the Drupal SharePoint struts being very much that matter of a little bit of is it well configured, but a lot of is it patched, just software composition analysis, or just making sure that you have a rudimentary patch management capability. But then when you're starting to talk about the injection attacks and cross-site scripting, what's interesting there is that unlike CSRF, we haven't seen as much pervasive cross-site scripting fixes or SQL injection fixes in the frameworks themselves. And I say that even knowing that we've had prepared statements and parameterized queries for ages with SQL. So I am curious, though, and on this subject of SQL, just to try to pick on that a bit, I would be curious, what's the difference there between perhaps the age of the application that's being built or the style of the applications being built? And I'm trying to avoid saying the actual particular programming language, but more of, is it an old LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, or set aside the P and just something where it's building that type of SQL queries, web application, or is it cloud native where perhaps you have something that's more of a better identity and access management story? You have lambdas that are connecting and pulling data out, or you have larger, I'm going to use the term data lakes because that's a fun word, but the way that we're accessing and programmers are accessing these areas, these data lakes, aren't using the raw queries as much, or maybe that they're just the nature of how they're building it. There's something in the frameworks that's making that better. So that would be one of the things that I'm at least hoping we're moving towards in the CSRF sort of example, is that we have a framework that's making something better here for us.
Right. I mean, I don't have any specifics there for, where we're seeing these attacks, if it's with legacy applications with new vulnerabilities being exposed or new applications. I'm inclined to think we're still seeing them with new applications being developed, because I think part of the problem here is we want to blame technology, but there's also a person on a human side to all this with cognitive bias, where, maybe I'm developing an application and this is the way I've always done it, and it's worked so far. And I'm still using the same practices that I've been doing for years. And finally, one of those practices catches up with me and that web application gets popped. Or it could be, that certainly with some of the frameworks, they do handle user-supplied input better, through sanitization libraries. But even these libraries, from time to time, we identify vulnerabilities with the libraries themselves where they can then be exploited. So I think it's not something we can peg down to, is this legacy apps or new apps? I think they're still being created today. And I think trying to identify the source of this is it's a very broad, mile wide attack surface between the developers who've been doing it this way for years, the security teams that may be not fully testing their applications. Maybe they're only testing their flagship applications and not testing these other sites that become chained as part of this attack. Or maybe they're, for example, when the US power grid was hacked in 2019, it wasn't that these malicious actors targeted the U.S. power grid directly. They started targeting all these subcontractors and teams and companies that were affiliated and worked with these larger U.S. industrial control systems, so that when the malicious actors were able to compromise these smaller networks and everything, they were able to create phishing attacks that looked legitimate because this U.S. industry power, the power industry itself, they were familiar with these companies and had been working with them. So to get an email from them with some document wasn't out of the blue. So I think we have a bunch of problems here. Whether it's the human element where we've always done things this way and it's hard to break out of that cycle. Some of the frameworks that do get developed, certainly like we've done with CSRF, we've created all kinds of approaches technologically to prevent it. But we're still finding vulnerabilities the same old-fashioned way, which to me lends itself to a problem of we're not testing everything. Things are going to production without being tested, and we're using frameworks that just allow these vulnerabilities to exist. And I think that's where we as an industry need to try to get ahead of everything. We need to start changing these frameworks so that these vulnerabilities cannot exist anymore, like we've done with the CSRF technologies. We have everything from same-site cookies being used by your browsers to frameworks that will automatically make sure that you're not vulnerable to CSRF or through using CSRF tokens. We've had recently an explosion with APIs, right? And APIs are still vulnerable to a lot of the same injection attacks. And I feel like that was a missed opportunity. We just adopted the same architecture, same framework, same development process, same languages for APIs when we had an opportunity here to try to get ahead of it, to create something that might be a little bit more robust, a little bit more secure. I think part of this challenge, and I talk a lot, so I apologize, is we bolt on security. We bolt on new features instead of making sure the underlying infrastructure itself is safe. So we don't have time to run a scan, or we're not going to scan everything. So let's put a firewall on it or a WAF on it. And we think that makes it secure. Defense in depth is great, but we need to make sure that bolted on security isn't really hiding a vulnerability that later a malicious actor with time and logistics on their side can find a way to exploit.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned same-site cookie, because that I think is a great way that the browser developers said, here is a way that we can make it really easy to decorate a cookie and basically get rid of a class of vulnerabilities, how that cookie is misused in CSRF types of scenarios. And that was much more successful because I think it was easier to deploy, easier concept than, for example, when browsers came out with content security policies, let alone CSP level 1, 2, or 3, which seem great on paper, but are really difficult to deploy. So I think there's a lesson there too, in the sense of we can have a solution, we can have a better framework, but the framework actually has to be adoptable and be able to be implemented by developers in a way that's actually going to be easy for them. And I think I stepped on John. Speaking of people who want to talk, John, we need to hear you.
No worries. I was just going to give the other John a moment to catch his breath. So I spent the weekend, and I'm still trying to dig through here. I can't quite find what I'm looking for. I've got, we over the years, we cover all these reports from all these vendors, and they all have sort of, interesting stats or graphs in them. So I spent a good chunk of the time over the weekend just trying to gather these onto one computer and then into a single directory so I can dig through them quickly when I'm doing talks and stuff. And I'm looking now, and I can't find what I'm looking for. I'm looking for sort of thinking about the history, call it last 5 years, of OWASP type vulnerabilities, just web vulnerability attacks. And what I'm wondering is what has been changed, or what is changing. We know right now, I think one of the big patterns that we saw last year, guys, was issues in the frameworks which we depend upon. You were talking about this a tiny bit, John, but from the point of view of third-party vulnerabilities, which we're not tracking in open source and things like that. So that's not so much a category, but that's sort of a trend. I was looking at the Verizon's DBER, and they talk about trends between different industries. So, for example, and I'm going to get it wrong, so I'm not going to say the industry, but one would have web app issues at number 1 or 2, and then some other might be down around 6 or 7, like healthcare, for example. There was a lot of other issues before it even came near web app. So I can see it from an industry or class like that, but I'm looking for, and I'll keep digging here as we talk through, just in a given, in general, just focusing on web app issues. What's changing, going up or down? Like we know, like you guys were saying, CSRF. My sense is SQLi is dropping. But I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking within that crowd. Is it really? I guess the question where I'm going here, I'm not just yapping. The question where I'm thinking is back to John's premise: is are we really seeing the same issues time and time again, or are we learning, fixing one, going off to something else, and then either forgetting about it or something else is getting us? That's what I'm trying to sort of chew through and think about.
Yeah, I think I would riff on that in the sense of I haven't mentioned my favorite go-to with cross-site scripting and framework like React, for example, but I'll look at this in the sense of on the idea of Groundhog Day. Why do we keep repeating that? Oh, look, this is cross-site scripting. Everybody needs to be quizzed on what are the reflected or persistent or DOM-based cross-site scripting and the nomenclature and taxonomy of what the attacks look like. Versus, what if we actually built something that made it harder to introduce cross-site scripting, and therefore we get something like React, and that's we see cross-site scripting just a lot harder, less prevalent from that perspective. Another way I would look at this perhaps is WordPress. WordPress vanilla core is pretty solid. It's the architecture for plugins is where everything falls down. And that's where they have a little bit of, we could call it the Microsoft problem, if you will, in the sense of it's a long-standing application, and it has quite a legacy of architecture and supporting plugins that maybe has tied their hands a bit to figure out, well, we want to have this plugin model, but our architecture is really poor, and one small vuln is basically a massive vuln just because of the way that things can be, the plugins can be leveraged into an RCE, SQL injection, cross-site scripting just from that, because it's not the same constraints that it has on the core. So just kind of speaking out loud, trying to go with what you were alluding to there, John, in the sense of, why are we having these conversations? Is it because we're just trying to say, hey, everyone, did you know that cross-site scripting is a problem? And we're just focusing on that versus, well, what if we actually did something about it? What if we introduced a same-site cookie that's actually really easy to adopt and works for web applications in a way that has an easy path to adoption, a migration platform, or a migration path, if you will? Maybe there's something there to do better.
I mean, isn't that how Phil got out of his cycle in Groundhog Day? He stopped doing things for himself and started taking a broader look at trying to help everybody around him, right? And that's ultimately, how he kind of breaks out of that cycle himself. And I think those examples you brought up are very applicable. As long as we're playing whack-a-mole, either at the micro level or macro level, if I'm in my organization, I'm just fixing whatever vulnerability pops up on that last scan, and I don't see the broad picture, I'm missing opportunities there to address the same vulnerabilities across all of our applications. And maybe that's a conversation I need to have with the developers themselves. Or if I'm playing whack-a-mole and fixing a vulnerability here, instead of coming up with a generalized solution that works like the same site attribute token cookies do, again, that was an opportunity for a more holistic approach to resolving this type of vulnerability that you had to kind of take a step back and look at the broad picture to come up with. So I think absolutely we need to change our approach where we're not treating this at a app level or organizational level, but more opportunities for the Chrome browser and Firefox to say, hey, maybe these are some solutions we should look at to protect the end user. They've done that a lot already, but we need that on a larger scale from more of the industry leaders to help come up with a way for us to make sure these apps are secure. Like if I take my car to a repair shop to get repaired, if I don't see that, American Society of Engineers, credentials on that store or that mechanic shop, I'll probably think twice about it. However, we have code that gets developed and deployed without those kind of security credentials. So maybe part of this is if I'm developing a WordPress plugin, kind of like an app through like the Apple Store, it needs to go through some vetting process before it becomes a WordPress release that is generally available, or something along those lines, so that the consumers themselves who aren't going to get into the weeds of configuration will have a plugin that is going to be secure, that this, there are some credentials back behind this plugin that we know has made it, that it's been vetted, and that way WordPress, the vanilla one, the core is fine, but this way we can also start to create a mechanism so that these plugins themselves have some assurance that they've also been secured in some fashion as well.
That's interesting. Go ahead, John. Sorry, it's an interesting analogy. The two coming off the top of my head is we've got, Kubernetes certifications. We've got, I'm thinking containers. So Docker certifications. Linux, Red Hat, certified system administrator. We have all those type of things, which are both showing that someone's learned something as well as sort of the rubber stamp for when they're getting hired. And as you were saying that, John, I was thinking I could see people not wanting a certification for a language because programming is easy, but obviously not since, as you were saying, we've been playing this Groundhog Day game for a while. But it's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess ISC2, I think, has a secure coding standard, if I remember right, or a secure coding certification. So maybe there's some traction happening on that, but that's an interesting idea.
Well, what about just, you always think about your security team is going to go get their SANS training on security, right? I'm going to take the web app or the pen test one, or I'm going to go out and get the OSCP. But I don't often hear of a similar security requirement being pushed down to your developers. And so maybe some of this is they're aware of vulnerabilities, but either they don't know the story, right? They don't know the story about how a vulnerability becomes an exploit, becomes your site's been breached. What is that whole story, not just a graph or a metric? Or maybe once they have this awareness through this training, it kind of changes some of their practices. I don't know. I'm not a professional developer, and I can't speak on their behalf, and nor do I want to lump them into a category. I'm sure there's plenty of developers out there that are well-versed in vulnerabilities. But some kind of certification so that I know that the code that's been deployed has been deployed by a team that not just the security team, but the developers have some kind of security knowledge and training applied. I think that would go a long way to helping resolve these cross-site scripting SQL injection vulnerabilities that we see again and again.
And I guess let me throw one more thought out there, Mike. I know you had something on your mind, but saying that we need a certification, that's sort of hinting that we think that developers don't know what they're doing. I know I've seen a trend where the developers are more and more aware of AppSec over the last 10, 15 years. So probably also part of the question is, even if you get someone certified, if they're on a time crunch and trying to get something done in a hurry, are they still going to make mistakes? Or so we'll probably need both the certification as well as the frameworks to be better. That's my thought.
But there's accountability there, right? So if I say, hey, I have a certification and I can do this, and I don't, how is that reflected on me and my and how I'm being reviewed or evaluated as an employee? I mean, do we have those controls in place? I don't know. Every organization would do it differently, but to me, if I have something on paper that says I can do something, now you can hold me to a standard. And if I fail to meet that standard, there should be some action there as well.
Yeah.
And I don't want people to get fired, obviously, but take the aviation industry. We don't see the same problems with system failures that we do with the automotive industry. And if you take the automotive industry, we don't see the same types of system failures that you might see with some of these other industries that are less regulated, right? So the more regulation, the more eyes you have on something, the more training you've received, that should mean something. And when I violate what I have said that I can do, now there becomes something I can be held accountable for. And I think that is something that's probably missing.
But and I really will stop after this. The unfortunate side of that analogy is the GPS in your car is more expensive than the GPS on my bike, and the GPS in your plane is way more expensive than the other two. So we have to try and figure out how to balance the cost of those as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I think process plays a little bit in this as well, John, because you hinted at it. You didn't go all the way there, nor did John, our John, which is, look, the closer I get security testing to the developers and the development process, the sooner I see this stuff, and maybe the sooner I fix this stuff. And I think process and the CI/CD pipeline and introducing security testing along the way can actually help us here, at least from an awareness and a visibility perspective. Now, again, you still need to know how to fix it. You still have to fix it before you put it in production. But we can also make some process improvements here, I think, along the way.
Sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead. I was going to say, not to shamelessly plug Qualys, but we do have integrations into CI/CD pipelines where your information security team can even set up so that a build will fail if the security scan itself fails, so that it is a all stop until that developer can remediate these vulnerabilities. And then certainly that is one way to kind of focus on security and make sure that it is integral to that development process.
Now, I know this is the Application Security Weekly show podcast, but in a way, my kind of gut reaction to as we're talking about training is that why don't we make the training certification just the principles of DevOps or the principles of engineering, and even talking about riffing on the metaphors of airlines, you have the NTSB and postmortems, really investigations when crashes happen, and do they become pilot error, mechanical error, these things like that. But what I'm going with there is rather than just saying that we need training on every one of the OWASP top 10, which I know nobody here was advocating quite for that, but I would switch it around and say, forget the OWASP top 10 and not even worry about cross-site scripting, for example, because we could give someone a React framework and they pretty much aren't going to make any cross-site scripting mistakes unless they really go out of their way to do so. And I think what will then happen is that we could have better frameworks and better DevOps discipline. And I think that's the process that appealed to me, is what Matt was getting at, in the sense of, do you have basic linting? Do you have basic software composition analysis, some type of application security testing within the SDL, wherever it's appropriate for SAST or DAST, what have you? And by that point, you get to a deployed application. And then rather than playing whack-a-mole because a vuln came in and you want to figure out, this is my CWE number 32 or 600, or I can't remember how many CWEs there are now. But rather than that, you just take a look and step back and say, what's our engineering discipline tell us we need to do? Should we fix this? Or should we step back and say, WordPress, for example, has a plugin architecture problem, and we need to figure out how to change this particular capability so it's now isolated, it's sandboxed. And we've seen some of these in the sense of containers and attempts with syscall BPFs, and being able to say we're going to do allow and deny particular syscalls, or we're going to isolate different things, different parts of the application in different ways. And I guess where I'm really just trying to go with that is that pushing for certifications to say this is how we would provide some very fundamental capabilities of an architecture of an application, as opposed to just the trivia of ways that applications are attacked.
I think that's a great point as well. I don't think we're going to solve any of these web application problems by addressing them just at one weakness in this whole chain. I mean, going back to CSRF, we saw CSRF tokens, different frameworks creating their own implementation, same site attributes. So I think it's going to be a multilateral attack, right? Where, we are creating a framework that is secure. We are making sure that security testing is going on as far left as possible. I think there's going to be a whole bunch of steps that are required for us to start to really see a change with how web application vulnerabilities are being addressed and how they're being exploited.
Yeah, and I think if we always say that it's the developers that need the training because that's where the insecure code is coming from, that's basically because the developers are the ones writing the code, period, right? So one of the things I always try to go to is, yes, exactly. So why don't we also say, where is the programming certifications, or just call it programming education for AppSec teams? And how many AppSec teams do we want to turn into applied engineering teams as opposed to just pure pen testing, so to speak, in-house pen testing? So I think a couple different ways that organizations could approach this. And I think it also depends on the context of their maturity, their size, and many things. So it's not a one-size-fits all, as much as you were saying, but it's good to be able to look and figure and think about strategically what would make the most sense for our organization.
Yeah, we have to break that cognitive bias that we have, right? That I, as a security guy, comes in and says, "Oh, we need more testing," and I push that. So everybody up to the CISO level needs to recognize that you need to adapt to whatever the situation requires, and we break that cognitive bias that we might have coming into an organization with our own unique experience, background, education, so that we recognize there might be some better solutions than what we've done in the past, and understand that everybody on the team might, we need to hear them out and open that up so that any kind of interesting ideas that they have can trickle up to the top as well, so that we can find the best possible solution and not just the solution we've always done, and maybe enforce it in a different way.
No, that's a great point. And it reminds me that tomorrow's Groundhog Day, and you brought us this wonderful premise that AppSec seems to repeat itself a lot without necessarily anything to show for it. Now, I know I have a few things I would name, and one of the things I would name is John Delaroderie for bringing us this wonderful repetition, but possibly also breaking out of the cycle for vuln scanning. So, John, I want to thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here, and I'm glad I could talk about a great film by Harold Ramis and Bill Murray. So, thank you.
It is a wonderful film, and also of Ghostbusters, Stripes, many other collaborations that they've done. But we had you on before, and hopefully we'll have you on again, John, because this was a really fun conversation.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Also want to thank our other John, Kinsella, and Matt for joining me. If you'd like to learn more about Qualys, visit securityweekly.com/Qualys. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.